Okay, well, I'll begin because I'm sure you want to get out of here. So I was asked to do a story, do a reading to do with Mother's Day, but I realized afterwards I have actually never written a story about a mother, which is a big lack, and so I must think about that a bit more. But what I have done is I published a collection of short stories in February this year for Valentine's Day, and one of them in there is called Sir Robert, the Dog, and the Dimple. And you'll see that in it there is a mother. She's a wonderful mother. She's very scatty, but she's a wonderful mother. But also she, more than that, as all of us mothers are, pretty much, we're also wives and sisters. And so being a mother is only one of our labels, right? And so I think this story may not be that irrelevant after all, because it does, in fact, deal with a mother who is a sister and also a wife, and very good at all those things. So anyway, this is called Sir Robert, the Dog, and Dimple. I'm sorry, came a clear, well-bred woman's voice from the parlour, but no matter who the gentleman may be, it's impossible for me to move Miss Worthington now. You can see how poorly she is. But madam, came the harassed landlord's voice from the same direction, Sir Robert cannot be made to wait out in the hall. He is desirous of partaking luncheon, he bespoke. Sir Robert, waiting in the hall with a small spaniel, not much more than a puppy, frisking by his heels, decided it was time to intervene. He walked into the parlour and there beheld a plain woman, plainly dressed, hovering over an equally plain young woman, lying ashen-faced on the settle by the wall, her eyes closed. With the good manners for which he was known, he bowed. But with no such reserve, the spaniel, observing opportunities for making new friends, gaily trotted up to the plain woman, standing there, and placed both front paws on her grey gown. Sir Robert was pleasantly surprised to see that the woman did not shriek or push her away, but rather distractedly patted the silky head. I'm sorry, madam, said Sir Robert. Molly has no discretion. She seems to think everyone and everything in the world is her friend. This personality trait, though charming in its way, rendered her useless for duck hunting. She was convinced the birds were her playfellows. I'm taking her to my sister for the children. I could not leave her in the carriage for fear she befriend a passing squirrel and form such an attachment that she would be lost forever. Though I may have been able to bear up under the separation, my sister would never have forgiven me. He was delighted to see a dimple peeping on the lady's cheek, though she said nothing. Sir Robert, the landlord, bustled forward. Miss Fellows, and you know that I got that from Jeff. Fellows, replied the plain lady, dimple gone. Nicola Fellows. Sir Robert bowed again, but the landlord continued. Miss Fellows is insisting on remaining in the parlour you bespoke for your nuncheon. It seems the young lady cannot be moved. She's much too well to be moved. Anyone can see that, explained Miss Fellows. But Sir Robert, I pray you to continue. If you can be happy eating your meal at the table, we will stay quietly over here and not disturb you in the least. You may eat with your back to us and forget we are here, she added, with a spark of humour in her tone. Sir Robert bowed again. Thank you, Miss Fellows, he said. That would seem a very sensible solution, except for the recommendation about turning my back. I'm afraid I should be too uncomfortable to eat at all under circumstances like that. Is your companion asleep? If so, might you be persuaded to lunch with me? That is, unless you have eaten already. Nicola was still recovering from the bustle of helping her charge off the mail coach, holding her shoulders while she was copiously sick into the bushes at the side of the yard, and almost carrying her into the parlour, calling for a glass of water, and ignoring the landlord's protests, laying her on the settle in the parlour. She had dealt with the driver of the mail, who followed her into the inn, saying vociferously he had no time to spare, and if Miss was going to be a lay-in there, Their luggage would be taken off the coach and they could take their chances with the next one. She had said distractedly he must do what he must, and their bags were now piled in one corner of the parlour, looking as sad as their contents undoubtedly were. It was only in the last few minutes that she had become aware of the delicious smells emanating from the back of the inn, reminding her that she had eaten nearly nothing all day. Yes, she therefore responded to Sir Robert. Irene is asleep, thank goodness. Neither of us had any idea how sick she would feel on the coach. We've neither of us travelled much before, you see. I was fine, but the poor girl began very soon to feel unwell. She held on as long as she could, but when we stopped here, she said she simply had to get off. It's a good thing we did. She was fearfully sick. Anyway, she concluded, thank you. I should be glad of a meal, though it seems heartless to say so. I must confess, I am very hungry. Sir Robert replied with a smile, then I'm glad to be able to invite you to share my lunch. But I should introduce myself properly. I'm Robert Heathsmith, at your service. He bowed for the third time. And you are Miss Fellows. She nodded and extended her hand, which he took. And Irene is your... He was going to say daughter, but now he looked at Miss Fellows more closely. She was younger than he had at first thought. Not in her first youth, but surely not more than 30. She was rather small and very slender. Her long, thin face was rendered horse-like by the tight braids wound in bands around her head. But now that he looked at her, he saw she had fine eyebrows arched over rather deep-set but intelligent eyes, and there was the shadow of that elusive dimple. My pupil, supplied Miss Fellows. I am her governess. For her part, she had formed an immediate good opinion of Sir Robert when he entered the room. Apart from his excellent manners, he was good-looking, of course. He was tall and well-dressed, though not extravagantly so. The grey wool coat that fit him to perfection had not been made by any provincial tailor, and his dark breeches were tucked into top boots that still shone in spite of the mud splatters around the foot. His brown hair was brushed forward into what she did not know was a Stanhope crop. He looked like what he was, a gentleman of comfortable and perhaps even prosperous means, with an estate in the country. He had talked about hunting, after all, and no doubt a place in town. But Molly had also smelled the kitchen odours and had run off to investigate. They suddenly heard a crash and a commotion accompanied by a loud, angry wail. Ears flying, Molly came running into the room with what looked like a chicken leg in her mouth, followed closely by the landlord. The animal has bitten the leg off the nice capon prepared for your nuncheon, sir, he exclaimed. I am afraid my wife is having something of a spasm as we speak. You wretched animal, I should have let them drown you, exclaimed Sir Robert, picking Polly up by the scruff of her neck and removing the leg from her mouth. To do her credit, the dog repaid this gross injustice by giving her master a lick on the nose, which caused Miss Fellow's fleeting Dimple to put in an appearance. Well, since it was my capon, bring the remains of it and we'll eat it anyway. He placed the mangled leg on the table and put Molly on the floor. The unrepentant dog now made every effort to leap up the table leg to retrieve her prize, but the table was too high, and no chairs had as yet been placed next to it for her to scramble onto. You shouldn't eat chicken bones anyway, Molly, said Miss Fellows. They may stick in your throat. I'll strip the flesh off for you in a minute. Now, sit down. She said the last two words in a very firm voice, to which the dog responded immediately and sat down on her plump haunches, her tongue hanging out and a smile on her face. Good heavens, you're the first person the dratted animal has minded, said Sir Robert. Years of being a governess, replied Miss Fellows. It gives one a voice of authority. Yes, indeed, said Sir Robert. I almost sat down myself. He was rewarded by another glimpse of the dimple. During the course of the meal that followed, Sir Robert learned the circumstances surrounding Miss Fellows. She had been governess to the motherless 13-year-old Irene Worthington for 5 years, since the death of the girl's father, until the death of the girl's father a few months before. Irene's uncle, heir to the small family estate, was a bachelor gentleman in his 40s. He had no desire to saddle himself with the girl and her governess, and had written to his sister to ask to take them in. They were now travelling to London to their new abode, which, Miss Fellows said, was exciting for both of them, as neither of them had ever been to the capital before. If Sir Robert thought it rather shabby of the relations to put two inexperienced women on the mail rather than arranging private transportation, he said nothing. Evidently there is another mail coach at 5 this afternoon, and I hope to find places on it. We should be in London by 7, which I hope Mrs. Fullerton will not consider too late. It's a fine summer day, and the evenings will be light for a long time. My only fear is that poor Irene may be unwell again, and then I don't know what we shall do. She did not want to tell this comparative stranger that they really didn't have the funds to stay anywhere overnight, or even, come to that, pay for 2 more mail tickets, if the driver refused to honour the ones they had already bought. They had almost finished their lunch when Irene awoke. She sat up and looked around her, a little dazed. Her governess immediately went to her, followed by Molly, who was hopeful of making another new friend. "Oh, what a sweet little dog," said Irene. "Whose is it?" "Molly belongs to this gentleman who has allowed us to share his parlour," explained Nicola. "Sir Robert, this is Irene Worthington." Irene stood up on shaky legs and attempted a curtsy, but was forced to sit down again. "Oh, I feel very dizzy," she said. "Let me bring you a cup of tea," said Nicola. "There's still some left in the pot, and the water is hot." She poured a cup into which she stirred a generous amount of sugar and gave it to the girl. Irene drank it gratefully. Molly had scrambled onto her lap, and she sat stroking the dog's long silky ears. When she had finished, she looked up, saying, "I do feel a little better now, but, oh, Nicola, I don't think I can bear to get inside another stuffy mail coach. Do you think they would let me sit up next to the driver? There were young men up there before, so I know one may travel that way. If I can just be in the open air, I think I won't feel so sick." Miss Fellows frowned and opened her mouth to answer, but was cut off by Sir Robert, who said, "If I may, I think I can provide a better solution. I'm driving my coracle. It's fully open air, and while not really built for 3 people, you ladies are slim enough to only count for 1. Of course, Molly will probably object to giving up her place, but it may be possible to persuade her to sit on one or other of your laps." Since the animal in question was presently stretched out on Eileen's lap, with a look of ecstasy on her face, as the girl stroked her tummy, that comment caused another peep of the governess's Dimple. And so it was that less than an hour later, the 3 companions were bowling merrily up the road towards London. Driving his horses at a comfortable trot, Sir Robert was able to ascertain the address of the aunt in London. It was, he realised, with his superior knowledge of the city, situated in a rather less than fashionable area. Irene chattered happily along the way, commenting on the sights. She seemed to have recovered completely from her sickness, and even began to speak of being hungry. When Sir Robert offered to stop, both women refused, saying that they were sure Aunt Fullerton would have dinner for them, and they didn't want to delay their arrival any further. However, when they arrived at the address in a rather narrow street from which all sunlight appeared to be excluded, they found no one at home. The knocker was off the door, and all the windows closely shuttered. Miss Fellows was at a loss. She was sure Irene's uncle had written to his sister. Mrs. Fullerton knew they were coming. How very odd. It was to be hoped nothing dreadful had happened to the family. It was only when Sir Robert inquired delicately whether they had seen Mrs. Fullerton's answer to her brother's missive, they admitted that neither of them had. They realized at last that Uncle must have simply assumed it was all right and allowed them to depart. He was no doubt glad to be rid of them, thought Sir Robert. Out of sight, out of mind. The problem now presented itself as to what should be done with the ladies. Luckily, unlike Irene's uncle, Sir Robert has a sister of whom he was very sure. He knew that if he asked for a favour, she would gladly do it for him. He said to Miss Fellows, "I am perfectly sure my sister will be glad to house you until we can find out what has become of Miss Worthington's relations. I propose taking you there now. I have to go there anyway," he added, by way of inducement, "because that's where I'm taking Molly." Miss Fellows hardly knew how to answer, but the evening was drawing in, and they had nowhere to go, and very little money to pay for lodging. The offer seemed a godsend. She thanked him and accepted. The part of town into which they were now driven was, even to their untrained eyes, very much better than where they had just been. The streets were wider, the homes larger, and the setting sun threw a golden glow over it all. The minute they entered the house, however, the glow was followed up in the chaos that confronted them. Sir Robert's sister was introduced as Mrs. Prestwick, or Lady Cynthia, to use her birth title. She was a tall, beautiful woman, but as untidy as her brother was neat. Her hair fell from its pins, her lovely Norwich shawl trailed behind her, and her children, of whom there seemed an inordinate number, clung to her skirts in spite of the clucking of a harassed-looking woman, somewhat more than middle-aged, referred to as Nanny. The house was fearfully untidy. There were open books on every surface, some pushed to the floor, and toys everywhere. Molly immediately found an unidentifiable wooden animal under the round table in the middle of the room and began to chew on it. "Dreadful, isn't it?" said the lady of the house cheerfully. "We used to try to clear it up, but it was always the same at the end of every day, so in the end we gave up." Lady Cynthia seemed in no way discomposed by having two unknown females, and one a mere governess, thrust upon her. She gave her brother a hearty kiss on the cheek, and having listened to his explanation, held out her hands to the visitors. "Miss Fellows, Miss Worthington," she said, "you're welcome to stay here as long as you can stand it. Robert can only usually manage about an hour, but the children all adore him nonetheless." It was true. Nicola was now able to count them, and although at first it had seemed a positive crowd, there were only 4. They had abandoned their mother, and were swarming up Sir Robert's elegantly clad legs or hanging onto his hands. He laughed and swung one under each arm, with the other 2 still clinging to his breeches. He stalked forward, threatening fiercely that he was their wicked uncle, and he was going to dump them all in the kitchen sink. They shrieked and squirmed until he piled them in a heap on the already encumbered sofa and made as if to sit on them. "Goodness," said Nicola, hardly able to talk over the din. "What ages are your children? They all look about the same size." "I know," laughed her hostess. "I was foolish enough to have 2 pairs of twins within a year of each other, all boys, 3 and 4 years old. I don't know what wickedness I committed that I should be so punished." She laughed again and then called to her brother. "Robert, stop playing with the children. It's past their bedtime already. Help me take them upstairs. Nanny can't manage by herself." "Playing," responded her brother. "They were trying to kill me, the little devils. But I'm the big bad wolf, and I'm going to eat them up." And he grabbed randomly at little limbs and pretended to eat them. "Robert, you're as bad as they are. Stop it now." She marched over to the sofa, pulled her brother to his feet, thrust 2 of the children at him, took a firm hold of the hands of the other 2, and walked swiftly towards the stairs. Then she stopped and said, "Miss Fellows and Miss Worthington, why don't you come up with us? You'll certainly need to wash the dust of travel off, but pray don't change for dinner. Robert cannot, and my husband will probably not think about it at all." The 2 ladies followed the reluctant children and the determined adults upstairs. Having deposited her pair with Nanny and Sir Robert, Lady Cynthia showed them to a pleasant bedchamber at the back of the house, where their bags had been rather unceremoniously dumped. Neither of the visitors had extensive wardrobe, so it took them very little time to shake out their 2 or 3 gowns and hang them up. They were very crumpled, so it was just as well they did not have to change for dinner. They washed their hands and saw to their hair. At least, Irene saw to hers. Miss Fellows's plaits remained tightly wound around her head and had not moved an inch. It was still quiet when Nicola and Irene went downstairs. The salon gave the sad impression of a circus from which all the performers and audience had left. "Why don't you place all the toys over there in the corner, and I'll tidy up the books," said Nicola. "It seems the least we can do." When Sir Robert and Lady Cynthia reappeared, the salon was almost in order. At least, no one was in danger of turning an ankle by walking on an abandoned wooden block. Molly had fallen asleep under the round table, upon which neat piles of books were now arranged. "Good Lord," said Sir Robert, "it looks almost habitable in here. It must be your work, Miss Fellows, and yours, Miss Worthington, but I assure you, you will quickly tire of trying to sort out this household. It was quite interesting, said Miss Fellows. She had been surprised to see that more than half the books were dealing with mathematics. Now, this was a subject Miss Fellows had always had a keen interest in, though it was not something she usually talked about. As a governess, it was bad enough being thought a blue-stocking without compounding the image by an unnatural interest in that masculine pursuit. The explanation for the books was forthcoming. A gentleman suddenly appeared in the doorway. He would have been very handsome except for a vague expression and a pince-nez askew on the end of his nose, making him look rather comical. He was as untidy as his wife. His coat was buttoned incorrectly, and his neckcloth was hanging down on one side as if it had been pulled from his throat by an angry hand. He was certainly not dressed for dinner. Have I missed them? He inquired. Have they gone? He was carrying an open book, clearly showing pages of mathematical formulae. He put it down absent-mindedly on one of the recently cleared surfaces, and Miss Fellows instantly understood not only the source of the books, but also a good portion of the general disorder. He seemed not to notice the visitors, but peering myopically at Molly asleep under the table, said, "What's that?" "The dear little puppy we saw last time we were at Mallows, dear," answered Lady Cynthia. "Robert bought her for the children, and he has brought Miss Fellows and Miss Worthington to stay with us." She indicated the ladies, who stood up. "My husband, Mr. Prestwick." The gentleman bowed vaguely to the visitors and seemed to find it no more surprising that two unknown ladies should have come to stay for an indefinite period than that there was a puppy asleep under the table. "Are the children asleep?" he asked. "I had meant to come in before they went to bed, but I forgot." "I should leave it a few minutes before you go up, dear, until they really are asleep," said his wife. "You can give them a kiss then. We don't want them waking up. Robert made them so excited it was hard to get them to lie down." "How can you say I excited them, Cynthia, when you know I only have to come in the door for them to swarm all over me like ants on a sugar loaf?" protested her brother. "I am the one who needs to lie down." Since all of the women had seen him pretending to be the big bad wolf, his words were met with laughing disbelief. Miss Fellows looked down and her dimples peeped. Miss Wentworth laughed openly. "Come here, my dear, you are dreadfully untidy," said Lady Cynthia to her husband. This would have been ironic, coming from a woman whose gown was awry from the pulling of her children, and whose coiffure had now come completely loose from its pins. Except for the tender way she rebuttoned her husband's coat, righted his pince-nez, and rewound his neckcloth. When this was done, she smoothed his ruffled hair and kissed his cheek. He took her hand and brought it to his lips. They were obviously a loving couple. The butler came into the room at that moment, carrying a tray and glasses. "Thank God," said Sir Robert. "If I don't have something to revive me soon, you'll find me lying under the table with the dog." In due course, the assembled company was invited into the dining room for dinner. Irene was delighted to be included with the adults and went smilingly to the table with Sir Robert, who took one invited lady on each arm. Their host, who should by rights have performed this office, appeared lost in his own thoughts, and it was only the pressure of his wife's arm that seemed to propel him in the right direction. The dining room was surprisingly neat. This was explained by Lady Cynthia, who said they had taken to locking the door after the 4-year-olds had decided on a race that involved leaping from one chair to the other on either side of the table. All might have been well, except one of them had slipped and fallen on his chin and bitten his tongue. He had broken 2 chairs at the same time, but that was nothing, everyone agreed. The poor little boy had spoken with a lisp for months, but fortunately the cut seemed to have healed well. Dinner was a pleasant meal, mostly due to the brother and sister, who chaffed each other with great good humour. Entertainment of a sort was also provided by Molly, who woke up full of frisk and barrelled into the dining room, vociferously demanding to be included in the party. Sir Robert handed the puppy over to the butler and told him to take her to the kitchen, feed her, and put her out in the back of the house where she could run free. Sir Harold Prestwick, or Harry, as his family called him, seemed to be mostly in a world of his own, and usually had to be addressed at least twice on most subjects, until Miss Fellows quietly asked him which field of mathematics he was engaged in studying. Then he waxed eloquent on the writing of Carl Friedrich Gauss, which perhaps she had heard of. That opened a floodgate of discourse between them, which no one else at the table understood one word in 10, and indeed left them open-mouthed until Lady Cynthia tapped her glass and said, "It's time the ladies left the gentlemen to their port." Even then, Harry Prestwick stood up and would have followed Nicola, to whom he was still fervently talking, had his wife not pressed him back into his seat with a firm, "That's enough, dear." In the original story, I had a whole thing about Gauss. I was very proud of myself for looking up this mathematics, which is pretty incomprehensible to me too. But anyway, I took it out because I needed to cut the story down a bit. The evening ended quite soon after. The gentlemen came in from their port. Their host was laughing at something Sir Robert had said, causing Miss Fellows to think again what a very attractive man their saviour was. Seeing him come into the salon, she experienced a thrill quite unlike any she had previously felt in her chaste existence. The travellers were all tired, the lady of the house exhausted from the demands of motherhood, so they said early good nights. Sir Robert drove home, thinking how extraordinary it was that a plain country governess should talk so knowledgeably about mathematics. And then there was that Dimple. The ladies had to wait so long for hot water the next morning, they feared they must have missed breakfast, but they need not have worried. Their hostess was herself only just sitting down. The household was always at 6s and 7s in the morning, she said. Getting the children washed, dressed, and fed in the morning is a job for 3 or 4 people, and breakfast is often delayed. Their nanny and 2 of the maids usually take them all for a long walk, and I enjoy a quiet cup of tea. I recommend you do the same. The peace doesn't last long. Today they took Molly as well, heaven help them. My husband doesn't usually put in an appearance until lunch. He often works all night. He says it's the only time he can hear himself think. Sure enough, by the time the ladies had finished breakfast, the children and Molly were all tumbling into the house, completely ignoring the gentle remonstrations of Nanny. "She is a dear, but quite hopeless with them, I'm afraid," confided Lady Cynthia to Miss Fellows quietly. "But she's been with the family so long and is so devoted to us all, I cannot possibly pension her off. But they'll have a tutor in a year or so, and then they'll be off to Eton." Looking at the boys all rolling around like puppies, with a real puppy in the middle of them, it hardly seemed possible that in so few years they would be at boarding school. It brought home to Nicola that in a very short time Irene would no longer need her either. What would become of her then? She had the confused thought that if only Sir Robert's nephews had been girls, she might have been engaged as a governess for them. He seemed genuinely attached to his sister and her family, and that would have afforded her opportunities to see him. How pleasant that would have been. She allowed herself to dream. As the morning progressed, it appeared that Irene had a talent for entertaining the boys. She sat on the floor with them, patiently helping them put soldiers in and out of a little pull-along carriage, building arches and bridges with wooden blocks for the wooden horse and carriage to go under and inevitably knock down, to everyone's delight. Molly was especially good at the knocking down part, until, exhausted, she again fell asleep under the table. Then Nanny and a maid came to bear the children off for their dinner and a nap. But first Irene had the children put the toys back in the corner where they had come from. "The horse and the soldiers need a rest, like Molly. You can't leave them in the middle of the floor," she said. "Someone might walk on them and wake them up." They all agreed that would be very bad and complied willingly enough. After lunch, Nicola decided she had better write a letter to Irene's aunt and uncle back home to explain where they were. So Robert arrived in the middle of the afternoon and gladly franked the letters the governess had written. Because, you know, in those days, the members of the aristocracy could frank letters, and you didn't. Otherwise, the recipient had to pay for the letter. You didn't put stamps on them. The recipient always had to pay. "I drove past the house again before coming here," he said, "but there was still no sign of life. Luckily, a maidservant was shaking a rug out of one of the other front doors, and it seems she's friendly with the maid from the Fullerton household. She was able to tell me that they had gone away for their annual month by the sea, and they won't be back for another 2 weeks. I fear they never received the letter saying you were coming." 2 weeks, exclaimed Nicola. Whatever shall we do in the meantime? Why, stay here, of course, smiled Lady Cynthia. Irene is so good with the children, it's a positive holiday for me. And Harry will be dying to pick up the conversation he was forced to break off with you, my dear. It's so rare he has someone to talk about his work to. I understand nothing of it. Please do say you'll stay. So, in spite of Nicola's expressed fears that they would be an added burden, it was easily arranged. She and Irene fell into the relaxed ways of the household and were happier than they had ever been. Irene accompanied Nanny on the walks with the children in the morning and played or read with them in the afternoons. As for Nicola, as soon as he saw her, Harry Prestwick would bear her off to his study and show her what he was working on. She didn't always understand it at first, but her quick mind and instinctive grasp of the subject made her a useful sounding board. Sir Robert came to see them every day, sometimes for only an hour, sometimes for dinner. "'Pon my word, Robert," said his sister one day with a twinkle, we were not used to see you so often. What could be bringing you here every day? Don't tell me you miss your nephews." "No," replied her brother with a similar twinkle. "I'm never so happy as when they are outside and ignorant of my presence. It's Molly. I have to assure myself she is being well looked after. In a household like this, I'm afraid someone will forget to feed her." This made his sister laugh, and Miss Fellows's Dimple put in an appearance, for Molly had become a positive scourge in the kitchens. In a word, everyone was happy. Molly did what she liked and got away with it. Sir Robert enjoyed provoking the elusive Dimple. Nicola was content just to be in his presence. Irene loved the children, and Lady Cynthia enjoyed longer moments of peace and quiet. Even Mr. Prestwick, who normally noticed nothing, was pleased to have a kindred spirit to talk to. His sister knew, and Sir Robert was finding it harder and harder to deny to himself that the real reason for his coming so often was his infatuation with Nicola, or rather Nicola's Dimple. He had worked out that this elusive delight was produced when the owner was trying to swallow a smile, or was keenly interested in the topic of conversation and trying to hold herself back from breaking into it. In the company she now kept, between Sir Robert's joking and Mr. Prestwick's earnest explanations of fascinating mathematical phenomena, the Dimple appeared more than it ever had before in its owner's life. Lady Cynthia had begun to despair of her very eligible brother ever finding a wife. He had been in the company of a number of women over the years, but never one who had lasted more than a month or two. They bored him, he said. Yes, they were pretty, but what then? It was such a pity, thought his sister. He would make a wonderful husband and father. But it was a surprise to her when she first realized his fascination with Miss Fellows. On the face of it, the governess had little to recommend her. She really was very plain, and her gowns were hideous. But after a week in her company, Lady Cynthia had learned to appreciate Nicola's gentle dignity and her quiet sense of humour. No, she was not good-looking. She needed to be better dressed and have a new coiffure, but she had a certain something, and there was that Dimple. It was her only beauty, but it was a beauty, after all, that was permanent. Seeing her one morning before she plaited her hair in its usual tight bands, Lady Cynthia encouraged Miss Fellows to lead off her braids and tie her hair more becomingly in the nape of her neck. It turned out that her soft brown hair had curled when she released it from its confinement, and the curls had the effect of softening her long, thin face. Much better, thought her ladyship, wishing she was on close enough terms with the governess to offer her a better gown. But still, with those newly released curls and that Dimple, well, one never knew. Nicola, of course, had been in love with Sir Robert from the moment she saw him. It took her about a week to realize it, but when her heart simply refused to behave itself, she recognized it for what it was. She chided herself for her stupidity. What would a man like him want with a woman like her? The answer was clear. Nothing. She tried staying away from the salon when she heard his voice, but for some unaccountable reason he always seemed to find her. If she was in Mr. Prestwick's study, he had something he wished to say to his brother-in-law. If she was in the back garden, he wanted to play cricket with the children. Once he even found her in the kitchen where she was shelling peas. His excuse was he was looking for Molly, though the dog could be clearly heard barking in the back garden. In no way discomposed, he sat down and helped with the peas. Convinced this was nothing but kindness, Miss Fellows tried not to raise a face of joy every time he addressed her, but to efface herself and not join too much in the conversation, particularly at dinner. But these were precisely the circumstances that brought forth the dimple. Sir Robert found himself more and more fascinated. And she'd done something to her hair, hadn't she? How pretty those curls were. He found he had to force himself to take his eyes off her. Lady Cynthia might be untidy and a poor housekeeper, but she had the kind heart of a loving mother and was by no means stupid. She saw what was happening. Wanting to bring things to a head, she took matters into her own hands. One afternoon, Sir Robert arrived to find the salon deserted, the house strangely quiet. He was not to know his sister had asked Irene to help Nanny to take the children to the park, and had called her husband into the garden on the pretext she had something she wished to discuss with him. Nicola was in the study, looking for a proof they had been talking about. Sir Robert had begun to walk towards the study when he heard a crash and a cry. He ran the rest of the way and beheld Nicola suspended by her fingers from one of the top bookshelves. She thought she could see the book she wanted on a high shelf. She had used the library ladder. Both of the wheels of the ladder had stops on them, but it was the Prestwick's lazy habit to engage only one. Apparently this had given way or had been imperfectly locked, and when Nicola had reached for a book on the high shelf, she had inadvertently pushed the ladder away. The stop had disengaged, the ladder had come off its tracks and fallen to the ground, leaving her hanging. Sir Robert ran over and grasped her around her knees. "Let go, Miss Fellows, I have you safe," he said. She seemed reluctant, and he repeated, "I have you, I won't drop you, let go." Her heart was beating so hard, she was sure he could hear it. Nicola did as he bade her and let go. He took her slight weight, which was no more than he could easily manage, and allowed the full length of her body to slip down his. When her face was level with his, he held her for a moment and looked at her as if he might be going to kiss her. But she stiffened and looked down in confusion, so he let her go the rest of the way until her feet touched the floor. There was a moment of complete silence, which Sir Robert broke by saying gruffly, "Those damn things are a menace." He walked over and picked up the ladder, which had crashed to the floor, and leaned it against the bookshelves. Her heart still beating furiously, Nicola could say nothing. She turned and ran out of the room. When her brother found Lady Cynthia in the garden, she said, "Well, Robert, did you speak to Miss Fellows?" Her brother replied more airily than he felt, "What do you mean, speak to her? I rescued her from falling. The damned library ladder came adrift. Luckily she didn't fall and break her neck." "What?" They both leapt up. Mr. Prestwick ran to his library, not so much, it must be said, on account of Miss Fellows, but to make sure all his books were safe. Lady Cynthia said, "Oh, Robert, that's not how I planned it. I thought if you and Nicola were able to have a few minutes together, you might, I might what?" "Pop the question, you idiot! The two of you have been looking like April and May this last week at least. Don't tell me you haven't thought of it." "Well, since you bring it up, there was a moment when I was rescuing her that I thought I might, kiss her." "Kiss her? Did she give you any indication she wanted you to kiss her?" "No, in fact she stiffened and looked away." "Of course she did. She's a sly, shy, gently raised woman, not one of your light of loves. Really, Robert, for a man of your address and success with women, you really don't know us at all." Still, she mused, "It is something to build on, I suppose." She thought again. "I tell you what, don't stay to dinner tonight. Go away. I expect she's regretting not letting you kiss her. She'll be wanting to see you and not want to see you at the same time. Yes, it may be all for the best. Come back tomorrow. By then she'll be so glad to see you she'll fall into your arms." "Cynthia, you're the most ridiculous woman I know. Fall into my arms, indeed. She did indeed fall into them, and obviously didn't enjoy the experience. I'm leaving anyway. I'm promised to the Pickfords for dinner. But give Miss Fellows my regrets that I didn't see her before I left, and my hope that she's sustained no injury." He kissed his sister on the cheek and left. In fact, Nicola's sentiments were exactly what Lady Cynthia described. She kept running over the incident in her mind, at least the part where she slid down Sir Robert's muscular body. She almost cried in frustration that she hadn't let him kiss her. Why was she such a prudish fool? So what if it meant nothing? She would have been kissed by the man she loved, and that would have sustained her forever. As her hostesses said, she experienced equal disappointment and relief when he wasn't at dinner. Before they went up to bed that evening, Lady Cynthia drew her aside and said, "I'd like to talk to you for a moment, my dear. Irene, why don't you go on up to bed? I won't keep Nicola long." "I didn't have time to explain before," she said to the governess when they were alone. "It's always such a to-do getting the children ready for bed, though I must say Irene is a great help. We'll miss her when you have to go." They both sat on the sofa. "I wanted to tell you why Robert didn't stay to dinner. He told me he had been on the point of, kissing you, but you seemed not to welcome his advances. He was both embarrassed and disappointed. That's why he left." Nicola was stunned. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. He had been disappointed. Could it be true? But why would Lady Cynthia say it if it weren't? She looked at her hostess. "His advances were not unwelcome," she said quietly, "but I wasn't expecting it and I behaved foolishly. I'm sure you know I have no experience of that type of thing." She dashed away the tears that came to her eyes. "I'm sorry, She ran out of the room and up the stairs. Her ladyship remained seated on the sofa for a moment, a smile playing around her lips. The following afternoon, when Sir Robert arrived, Miss Fellows slipped quietly out of the room. This was just the opportunity Lady Cynthia needed. "Just as I said," she told him, not altogether truthfully. "It was only shock that made her react as she did when you looked as if you were going to kiss her. She was raised strictly and didn't know how to behave. But she loves you, she told me." Before her brother could answer, the knocker sounded, and Coombe, the butler, ushered in a woman who looked to be in her mid-30s, dressed in a pink gown much too young for her. She had several rows of pearls, obviously glass, around her short neck and hanging down over the front of her plump bosom. She carried a pink parasol with long tassels hanging from the handle. Her bonnet featured a high poke front with a pink silk not quite the colour of either the parasol or her dress, and embellished with a number of pink and white roses. It might have suited a girl of 18, but looking at her, Lady Cynthia could hear her grandmother's voice clearly. "Mutton dressed as lamb, my dear, mutton dressed as lamb." "Lady Cynthia," said the lady, coming into the room with her hand outstretched, "I am Prudence Fullerton. I've come to collect Miss Fellows and my niece Irene. It's so kind of you to have put them up for so long. I hope they've made themselves useful." She looked critically around the room, which was, as usual, in its chaotic state. "Indeed they have," responded her ladyship, ignoring the critical glance. "But please let me present my brother, Sir Robert Heathsmith." Sir Robert, who had been holding back, stepped forward. Mrs. Fullerton simpered and dipped into a curtsy. "Delighted, I'm sure," she said, holding out her hand, over which he bowed. "La, sir, to think my niece and her governess should have been staying with such high society. I hope it don't give them ideas above their station. They'll have to settle down and turn their hand to work in my simple abode. Not that I don't keep a neat place." Her eyes swept over the room again. "But where are they, helping with the housework?" "No," said Lady Cynthia, more calmly than she felt. "Irene is in the garden with the children, and Miss Fellows is helping my husband, I believe." "Let them be brought in here, so I may give them my instructions," said the newcomer. Sir Robert raised his eyebrows, but went into the hall and spoke quietly to the butler. In a few minutes, Irene appeared with all the children and Molly at her heels. The children ignored the newcomer and began a heated argument as who should do what in the knocking down game. Since not one of them listened and all strove to be heard, it was bedlam. Seeing a new friend, Molly added her voice and bounded, barking, up to Mrs. Fullerton and attempted to jump into her lap. The lady shrieked and cried, "Get down, you dirty creature, get down!" Nicola, coming into the room, heard her voice above the din. Sir Robert was delighted to see the elusive Dimple peep, although her face became serious immediately. "Sit down, Molly," said Nicola firmly. The dog plumped herself promptly down on her wiggling bottom. However, she then performed her new trick of scooting by small degrees while seated towards anything or anyone caught her fancy. In this case, it was the pink tassels that hung tantalizingly from the handle of the visitor's parasol. Miss Fellows came forward and held out her hand to her would-be employer. Mrs. Fullerton remained seated and touched it with her fingertips. "Irene," said Nicola, raising her voice to be heard above the children, "I hope you've made your curtsy to your aunt." Irene did. "Very pretty, I'm sure," said Mrs. Fullerton, "but nice manners won't do you any good if you're not prepared to pitch in." "Miss Worthington has been very helpful to us with the children since she has been here," interjected Lady Cynthia. "Good. I shall expect her to watch my youngest. I've recently got rid of Nanny, and my 6-year-old needs a firm hand. My older girl will need a governess. Miss Fellows can take her on." "But I am employed as Miss Worthington's governess, madam. She's only 13 and still a schoolgirl, not a nanny," said Nicola. "Oh, at her age she don't need no more schooling. She'll be much more useful watching out for my Jenny, and I need you for Susan." Robert's face was becoming more and more grave, and Lady Cynthia had been listening to this exchange with a growing look of astonishment. She was on the point of intervening when Sir Robert stepped forward. "Forgive me, Mrs. Fullerton," he said in his pleasant voice, "but I think there has been a misunderstanding. There is no question of Miss Fellows being governess to your daughter. She has just today done me the honour of saying she will become my wife, and I have every intention of applying to Miss Worthington's guardian, her uncle, to allow her to live with us. I'm confident he will agree." There was total silence in the room. As Nicola looked at Sir Robert, Mrs. Fullerton looked at Nicola, Lady Cynthia looked at Mrs. Fullerton, who had become alarmingly red in the face, and Molly took advantage of the fact that no one at all was looking at her. She leapt up and snapped at the swaying pink tassels of Mrs. Fullerton's parasol. To her own surprise, she caught one and pulled it off, shaking her head from side to side as if she were trying to break the neck of a rat. Mrs. Fullerton shrieked, stabbing at the puppy with her parasol. "My parasol! My tassels! You wicked, horrible brute!" She stood up and stabbed again, catching the puppy on her side and sending her whimpering under the table. "Molly!" cried Irene. She turned on her aunt. "You awful woman! He's only a puppy, and your parasol is just ugly." She ran over and knelt down under the table to calm the shaking dog. Mrs. Fullerton pulled herself up and marched towards the door, her injured parasol in her arms. "I shall leave this madhouse," she announced. "I would never have believed members of the nobility could live in such disgraceful disorder, allowing children who should be in the nursery to quarrel disgracefully in front of visitors, sheltering wild animals, and encouraging young women to be disrespectful to their elders and betters. I need not say that neither my niece nor Miss Fellows will be permitted to cross my threshold. I wish you a good day." She stamped through the doorway, holding her injured parasol like a sword in front of her. But in the ensuing bedlam, no one paid her any attention. The younger children, who had never heard adults with raised voices, began to cry, and Irene went to comfort them. A revived Molly was being petted by the older twins and was barking with delight. Lady Cynthia burst into laughter. Nicola heard none of it. She ran across the room to Sir Robert, who took her in his arms and kissed her. "Thank goodness," said Lady Cynthia. She looked at Nicola. "I take it that's your answer?" Miss Fellows looked down and dimpled. Then she raised her eyes with a smile. "Oh, yes," she said. "Yes, it is." Oh, Lady Cynthia was a great mother, right? All righty, there we go. Any questions, comments, criticisms?
So what was the title of that?
It's called, what was it called? Sir Robert, the Dimple and the Dog and the Dimple. It's a Robert Donohue. And it's a short story that is in a collection of other short stories.
Supposed to be PBS thing.
Well, I beg your pardon?
Supposed to be PBS dramas.
Oh, you think so? Well, that would be very nice. I wish you'd tell PBS. I'd love it. Then I could be frightfully wealthy. That would. I don't think I'm not counting on it. However,
Do these characters show up in other stories?
no,
Just-
not yet. No, I've written one trilogy which has the same characters in all three books. But to be honest, by the time I'd finished it, although I enjoyed the story, I was pretty fed up with the characters. So all of my other books are independent, they're all different. Yeah, obviously they're all romances. So there is inevitably a similarity between them all, but the stories are all completely different. And even in the short stories, they're all completely different. That one's called, what's the book called? Oh, I know, the book's called A Perfect Match. And I like the first story in that because I was going to read that, but it didn't have a mother in it at all. And so I thought, well, it's not really for Mother's Day. But it's actually a cute story about this young woman who decides absolutely that she's a young, sort of well-off young woman. That she absolutely wants to marry this older man. She's determined she would have nobody else. And she says, everybody keeps proposing to her. She says no to everybody. But he shows no interest in her whatsoever. So she decides to sort of basically stalk him, which we'd call it that nowadays. But so, and she does. But it turns out, of course, in the end, that he was sort of, he knew what she was doing. So it's actually a cute story. I liked it.
Tell us what you read with Mr. Gorman for
Oh, yes, that's in the same book, actually. That's also in that same book, which is called, as I said, A Perfect Match. Yes, for Lyceum, I read a couple of weeks ago now, with Bill Gorman, who some of you may know. He's a very well-known local actor and does a lot of voiceover on PBS, on SKG. I read a short story that I'd written, which is it's letters, just letters between a man and a woman. And it tells the story. It's basically a sort of enemies to lovers story. And that's one of the tropes of, romances. And so she starts out calling all the names under the sun, but of course they end up actually being married. So that's what it was. But Bill was, obviously, he was a guy and I was both of us, we laughed about it really, because we're both much too old really to be these young couple. That's the best we had.
Do you dream in Technicolor as your descriptions are coming out?
Do I dream in Technicolor? I do dream quite vividly, and also I have to say that when I'm writing, I see it very, very clearly in my mind. I absolutely see the scene, and I absolutely know what it looks like, and everything about it, and what the people look like, and what they sort of sound like. I do. It's somebody asked that on Twitter the other day, because I do Twitter every day because it makes me laugh. But all these young kids on Twitter are so full of angst. It's really quite laughable. Anyway, and this person said, "Oh, when you're writing, do you imagine your people? And absolutely yes, I do completely 100%. Yeah, but so does Frank. Where's Frank gone? Oh, he's gone to do. Oh well, you can tell. You see, you can tell how long we've been married. He actually prefers to go and put a cover on a boiler than listen to me, which is exactly doing. He's putting one of those white blankets over the boiler downstairs. He writes. Did you know that he writes cozy mysteries, all set in and around the Triple Cities.
But that's more recent that he started that.
Yeah, he started during COVID because
I know.
I wrote 3 books during COVID. It was great. I loved it. I loved not having anything to do except that. And so, but he got so sick of. He was pacing up and down because he's not good. His bottom is much too round to be indoors all the time. So pacing up and down. And finally, I said to him one day, "Oh, for heaven's sake, why don't you write a book?" "Okay," he said, "I will." And he sat down and he did, and he hasn't stopped. So he's written 7. Yeah.
Is he under his own name?
Yes, he's under F.J. Donohue. And you can find him on Amazon too. Although he doesn't actually publish through Amazon. There are various publishing houses that you can publish through independently. And he chose a different one from me, which is pretty much par for the course. I mean, we chose different wedding rings, Anyways, so there we are. That's it. I don't. Oh, it was so long. I did cut it down, but it was still longer than I thought.
You had 1 minute to think.
I did put some of my books over there just so as you can see them if you like. I'm not encouraging you to buy them, but you can buy them if you like, but they're $10 because Amazon, you have to pay for the printing and you have to pay for the shipping. You know, no getting around it. So I just thought I'd be